Good morning to those who are joining us from near and far. We're going to give folks just a minute or so to come on into the room, and then we will formally get started. My name is Dr. Devika Bhushan. Many of you and I may already be acquainted. I'm a pediatrician and the chief medical officer here at Daybreak, where we provide personalized mental health support to kids and families through partnering with schools and with health systems. And today I am so thrilled and honored to be welcoming Dr. Bruce Perry to Daybreak's community. As many of you will know well, Dr. Bruce Perry is a world-renowned child psychiatrist, neuroscientist, and trauma expert who has been actively shaping our understanding of brain health over the last 30 years through research, clinical work, writing, and education. Dr. Perry is the principal of the Neurosequential Network, and over the last 12 years, he and his team have worked with about 5,000 schools around the world to help them really understand how to use insights about brain science to optimize learning and resilience. In collaboration with Oprah Winfrey, Dr. Perry co-authored the bestseller, What Happened to You, among other seminal works. And personally, I know Bruce to be a deeply kind, compassionate, and generous human being. Bruce and I have known each other since my time at the Office of the California Surgeon General, where he served as an early and pivotal reviewer for the Roadmap for Resilience, our cross-sector blueprint for preventing and addressing adversity and toxic stress. And he was incredibly supportive when I decided to publicly share my own mental health journey while serving as acting Surgeon General for California. With that, Bruce, it is so wonderful to have you here. Thank you for spending time with us this morning.
It's my pleasure, Devika, and I'm looking forward to talking with you. It's always fun. We always have a good conversation.
That's right. So we'll kick it off with a fireside chat just to give you some basics and the lay of the land. And then we're going to transition to audience Q&A. So start thinking of those burning questions, put them in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So Bruce, to start, let's talk about what we mean when we say the neurosequential model in education in particular. In What Happened to You, you write, our brain is organized to act and feel before we think. Tell us what this means for how kids and educators are showing up in the classroom.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up because I'm continually getting grief from all of the people who are trying to that are good at communication, who say, you really need to simplify the name of this. It's too complicated. It makes people glaze over. And to some degree, that's true. But I believe that people can understand and learn new things. So I'm sticking with the name, the neurosequential model, because it really captures the core concepts that we're trying to convey. And the first part of it is that we, like many other people out there, are very well aware that the more we understand about how the brain works and how it changes and how it learns, the better we'll be at intentionally developing ways to better teach, the ways to better help children who are learning any brain-related skill, whether it's in sport or music or drama or communicating with their peers. All of those things involve the brain. And the sequential part of it is that what we know, and I think, again, everybody has heard this in lots of different ways, but the brain develops from the bottom up and the inside out. So the lower parts of the brain that are important in controlling simple regulatory functions are pretty well organized and present at birth. But the higher systems in the brain that are involved in speech and language and understanding math and creating sort of a capacity to anticipate the future and reflect on the past, those systems have yet to be developed. And so as you grow up, your brain organizes in a sequential way from the bottom to the top. There's a second part of that sequential organization that's really important for educators and for parents and for coaches, anybody who's interested in children. And that is that all of our sensory apparatus, when we, again, you all have learned this, but we don't really think about it in an integrated way. So remember that when you see something, your eyes basically turn physical energy into neuronal activity. And when you hear something, sound waves are turned into patterned, repetitive neuronal activity as well. But they come into the brain separately and they go into lower parts of the brain first. So the first part of us that gets the present moment is the lowest part of our brain. And at that level of the brain, there's a process of kind of trying to interpret and understand what's coming in, and then pass that information up to the middle part of the brain that processes it a little bit more complex, and then ultimately get it up to the very top part of the brain, which is the smartest part of our brain. And that's a sequential process. So initially, the first thing that happens when we experience the present moment is that the lowest part of our brain, that's really a reactive part of our brain, has the first dibs, the first opportunity to interpret and act on the information. So a perfect example that everybody's experienced is if you accidentally touch your finger to a hot pan in the kitchen. You literally withdraw your hand before you even know what it is, right? So your brain has processed that tissue damage signal and it's immediately acted before you even feel pain. So the first part of this sort of three-part processing is kind of reactive, and then the middle part is kind of emotional. That's where you assign value to the incoming input. Are you happy, sad, afraid? Does it hurt? And then the top part of your brain goes, what was that? And you go over there and you go, a hot pan. Next time I do this, I have to put the pan over here so that I don't accidentally touch it. And so your brain is always processing the math you're being taught and the conversations you're having at lunch with students and the expression that the principal has as you walk down the hall. Every one of those things processes for every child from the bottom to the top. And that means that the brain's kind of organized to act and to feel before we think. And yet, we're spending a lot of time as parents, as coaches, as therapists, as educators, telling kids to think before they act, which is good. And we're telling them to use your words. And the reason we have to do that is because we're swimming upstream against the current of biology. The biology would have us act before we think. And now again, I'm just to take this one step further so people don't feel completely disoriented, is that as your brain organizes and you go from the bottom to the top, and the top part of your brain, your cortex gets stronger and more capable, and you develop systems that help you understand language and speak and all of the complex things that happen up here. The cortex then starts to send, and really from birth it's this way, but these networks that go down to the lower part of the brain get stronger and stronger and stronger. And so that's what executive functioning comes from. It comes from growing cortex that can modulate the impulsivity of that default response to act on anything that comes in. And this is kind of one of the great gifts, the great tasks of educators, is you're building cortex, you're strengthening cortex. Anything that's sort of culturally related, music, dance, sport, reading, that provides pattern, repetitive activity to the cortex. It gets stronger and stronger and stronger, and executive functioning grows and grows and grows. And so the next time you feel frustrated, you don't immediately lash out. The next time somebody disappoints you, you don't immediately respond in a way that's sort of going to push them away. You're going to have a moment to be able to process a more complex element of that. You're going to consider it. You're going to think about it, and you will be more mature. And that's way too much. Sorry, I talked way too much.
No, that was great. Thank you for giving us that grounding in these concepts. And can you break it down for folks in terms of the three R's, what we can learn from the three R's?
My research journey and my clinical journey has been characterized by trying to take all of these complex things that our group and other people, the whole field has been learning about how the brain works, and then translate that into actionable and useful, if you will, models or heuristics so people can really make sense out of this complexity. And honestly, I failed at that miserably for many years. And little by little by little, we began to understand ways to communicate some of these key concepts that were useful. And probably the most useful, an example of the most useful version of this is when we started to help people understand what we call the sequence of engagement. And what we mean by that is it really is a simpler way of talking about what I just said, that if information comes in, the present moment comes into the lowest part of the brain first, and then it goes to the middle part of your brain, it's a little more emotional and reactive, and then it goes up to the top part of your brain where you're thoughtful and rational, and that's where you think. And so when you tell somebody to use their words, you're essentially trying to use their cortex first before you've regulated them and calmed down these sort of more primitive parts of the brain. So what we've learned is that if you want to reason with somebody, if you want to them to hear what you're saying, you need to help them take a deep breath, do something that will help them regulate those systems that are involved in being tuned up or upset. And they will then have a higher probability of opening up their cortex so you can actually effectively communicate with them. So that sequence of engagement is really to initially help regulate. And then once somebody is at a certain level of regulation, they don't have to be perfectly regulated, but regulated enough, then you take advantage of this incredibly powerful neurobiology of connectedness that human beings have to be present and use your relational skills and your relational presence to further regulate them and engage them in ways that really open up. It's like a superhighway to the cortex. So, and all educators know this. All educators know that when you can connect with a child, when they feel safe with you, when they feel seen by you, they're much more likely to take in the words that you're trying to communicate, the concepts that you're trying to communicate. And all really good educators are very good at thinking about ways to get kids regulated enough to connect and then connected enough to learn. And that's what the 3 R's are: regulate, relate, and reason.
Perfect. And so that really helps us understand that when a kid is activated or dysregulated, that they are not choosing to act in the ways and melt down in the ways that they perhaps are. It's really that they are struggling and the educator, their caregiver, whoever is in their orbit, their task is to help that kid learn how to first regulate what is going on for them in order to bring the cortex back, right? Because in that moment, the cortex is not available to them. So using words or reasoning with them, as you say, is not going to be effective until we sequentially help them regulate the lower part, the middle part, and then access the cortex. And you speak so powerfully, Bruce, about why rhythm in particular and rhythmically based somatosensory techniques like dancing and massage and walking are so deeply regulating. Can you talk us through that a little bit?
Sure. And again, this is a little sciencey, so I'm going to try to keep it simple. But everybody listening knows about the complexity of the brain. You've heard about there's billions and billions of neurons, and then they send axonal projections out, and neurons create synaptic connections. And all of that is true. And one of the major tasks of our brain is to help us make sense out of this complex sensory environment that we're in, so that we can survive and then thrive. And one of the major, if you will, molecular mechanisms that allows us to make sense of the world is to essentially make memory, to create associations between patterns of neural activity that co-occur. So when you are for example, when you're learning language, you see the image of a cow in a book, and your parent says makes the sound cow, 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 and literally you make a physical connection and create what we call a word. And so the brain is continually making associations between patterns of activity that co-occur. So you associate the feeling of warmth and connectedness through eye contact and a smile and a gentle touch because you're a little baby and you're getting cooed at and you're getting this whole complex set of relational signals. And also, you're not hungry, you're not thirsty, you feel warm, you feel wonderful. All of that stuff becomes connected. It, now, in utero, in the brain that's developing in utero before birth, the brain's going through tremendously rapid organization, and that process is also taking place in the fetal brain. And the fetal brain develops in rhythm, in continuous sensory pattern rhythm that comes from maternal heart rate and the opening and closing of the heart valves and the rushing of blood through the aorta that causes vibratory rhythm. And so vibratory, tactile, and auditory input at the entire time the brain's organizing. The entire time the little fetus is organizing, you're getting signals from your own body. We call these interoceptive signals. What's going on in the inside environment, not just the outside environment. The inside environment of the fetus is not hungry because it's getting nonstop calories. It's not thirsty because you're in liquid. It's not cold because you're at 98.7. And so those are signals that say I'm regulated, I'm regulated, I'm regulated. And so the sensation of being warm, satiated, not thirsty, safe gets connected with rhythm. And so once you're born, the world becomes arrhythmic. There's no rhythm. And all of a sudden, there's an explosion of sensory stuff that's way louder and way more visually stimulating than you are used to, and you get dysregulated. And what do? We replicate intrauterine cues. We turn the lights down, we talk more quietly, we swaddle the baby up, and we rock the baby at a rhythm that's either the primary or submultiple rhythm of the intrauterine rhythmic environment. And so as you grow up, you're getting reinforcement of that association between safety and regulation and rhythm. And that includes, and if you look at language and the prosody of language, sort of the rhythm of language, it's a submultiple of that traditional 60 to 80 beats per minute. If you look at the rhythm that cross-culturally mothers rock, it's the same all over the planet. It's in that submultiple area of 60 to 80 beats per minute. Chewing gum, walking, breathing. We do therapeutic techniques of bilateral touching and EMDR, and every culture uses some form of pattern repetitive somatosensory activity in their healing and regulatory rituals. And it's universal. And so that what happens is because of one of the principles of neuroplasticity, which all of you know, neuroplasticity is this incredible complex process by which the brain maintains the capacity to change. The brain is malleable. You can change systems, but one of the primary rules of neuroplasticity is that you will really not activate and change any part of the brain unless you stimulate it. So if a child has a regulatory problem that originates from some of these lower systems, it's very hard to talk them out of it. It's very hard to use top-down mechanisms to calm people down. So, as you all know, saying calm down to somebody rarely works. But if you say, let's take a walk, and you're in parallel and you're walking together, ultimately you can feel them become more regulated and more capable of using their words and engaging with you. And any parent or any adult who's driven a child in a car knows that when they're sitting next to you and the car is going, they're much more likely to talk than if you sit across the dinner table and say, "How was school?" And they'll just go, "Fine. What'd you do today?" "Nothing." "You did nothing today at school?" "No. I'm going to call the principal." "Don't be a jerk." That's and then you get in the car and they'll jabber, 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 jabber. So anyway, I go off on tangents. I'm sorry.
No, it's great. I'm smiling because I'm thinking about walking my own toddler home from school and how chatty he is. And then you get him at the dinner table and he's like, I don't want to talk about it. Everything you're saying definitely resonates. And, just to make this very concrete for, let's say an educator, I've heard you talk about, how moments of regulation can really be seconds long, right?
Yeah,
Microseconds sometimes. And
yeah.
so, what are some practices that you might recommend to a teacher in terms of how to open a classroom to really make sure that the cortex is as accessible as possible? And then
Yeah.
a two-parter for you. And then, what are some ways that an educator might actually intervene when a kid looks or acts like they're being activated or dysregulated?
Yeah. Well, let me precede that by one tiny bit of psycho ed that I didn't really talk about. And it again, if you sort of envision the brain as this upside down triangle, top part is the cortex, where all your thinking, and this is kind of what we teach to the cortex. This is really that's the net, those are the networks we're trying to change when we teach algebra and geography and English and all the traditional academic topics. Now, one of the things that happens with this three-part process of taking in the present moment is that when the lower parts of the brain get signals that make you feel stressed, right? That this is either overwhelming or unfamiliar or familiar and associated with bad things, you activate your stress response systems. And the first thing that happens with that process is you start to activate areas of the brain and body that will help you under those duress situations. But you also start to deactivate parts of the brain and body that you don't think you're going to need under duress. And so the top part of the brain is exquisitely vulnerable to stress. So there's a lot of things that we do, that is sort of abstract thinking and thinking about the consequences of our behavior and reflecting on lessons from the past. Those things disappear in the moment. And so what happens is a child who's distressed literally shuts down their cortex, and no matter how wonderful your curriculum is, no matter how beautiful the words are and correct they are, and whatever the evidence-based approach is, you're not going to get much change because the part of the brain you're trying to reach is unavailable. And so this is why regulation is so essential to education. And so to your earlier point, now the good news is, well, let me start with the bad news. The bad news is that your cortex is very, very easily tipped into an inefficient state. And again, every educator knows this. You know that by the end of the day, at 3, 4 in the afternoon, you've tapped out all of the ability of the child to stay focused and present and attentive. And you're not going to teach, you're not going to introduce a new concept like calculus at 5 o'clock in the afternoon because their ability to absorb it is gone. And almost all educators know that in the beginning of the school day is when you introduce new concepts. In the afternoon is when you try to reinforce things you've been introduced to. And that's because they have learned empirically that the cortex is more receptive when you're more regulated and you're coming to school and your cortex is open. But right before lunch, the more hungry and hungry and hungry you get, the more and more and more you shut down your cortex. And then you eat and you can go do recess and your cortex is open for business. And so really you can move your cortex very easily out of sync, and fortunately you can re-regulate very quickly as well. The the problem is many educational environments dissuade the kinds of things that easily regulate the cortex. So we're not big on tolerating movement. We're not big on tolerating, wiggling your leg or tapping your pencil or chewing your gum or listening to music because it distracts everybody else around you. So you have to think about how do we create group regulatory activities? Can we take the first 2 minutes of a class, stand up, do some deep breathing exercises, do a tiny little bit of bilateral swaying, and then sit down? And it only takes 2 minutes. And so that incredible reactivity of the brain to the sensory environment means that you can easily dysregulate somebody and you can easily regulate somebody. But if you don't intentionally regulate them, by the end of the day, everybody's going to be essentially very difficult to teach because they've had all kinds of little moments of unpredictability, little stressors. They're tired out. They've got a full bladder. They're sleep deprived. They're worried about the band, competition at the end of class, whatever it is. So that's the first thing. What we found is that if you take a couple minutes at the beginning of a class, and if you have a 45-minute class, and again, depending upon the age of the student, 10 minutes later, do another 2-minute thing. 10 minutes later, do another 2-minute thing. And even though you're taking instructional minutes away, you are making the remaining minutes much more efficient. And there's literally hundreds of studies that show the effectiveness of either integrating walking or movement or music or some sort of somatosensory regulatory activity into the school, and you both internalize new content more efficiently and you retrieve previously learned content better. So you test better. And again, this is something that I think the more educators learn about this, the more they come up with really creative ways to act on that.
This brings up a couple of points for me. One is that when we think about programs in schools like the arts and dance, right? Enrichment activities, so-called, they're actually so essential to helping a kid be in a place where they can optimize their learning and their overall sort of stress response systems and learn physiologic resilience, right? So there's so much about the structure of a school day, as you were saying, that sort of prohibits these moments of regulation and the intentionality around it. And I'm curious, from the perspective of a school administrator, what would you say most needs to change or shift about the structure of the school day to really open up the cortex?
That's a really good question. I think there's one very easy, very simple thing that all schools should do. And number one is, and I know that this is hard with working parents and everything, you just need to start the school day later. Sleep is such an important thing for consolidating what you've learned the day before and making sure it sticks in the cortex. It only happens with REM cycles. You got to sleep. The more sleep you get, the more you learn, and the easier it is for you the next day to take in new information. So think carefully about when you start school. And there are lots of studies that show that just even an hour change in when school starts leads to tremendous shifts in traditional educational outcomes like attendance and grades and so forth. Second thing is that you need to think carefully about recentering music, the performing arts, the creative arts, and sport. These are not luxury add-ons. These are essential elements of creating a fully receptive brain to cognitive content, to social content, to motor content. And it's no surprise that when you look at the traditional education of the privileged in Athens, where really Western education came from, they spent half of their time learning poetry, doing athletics, doing drama and song, learning how to, play different instruments. those activities were just as valued as memorizing or reading and learning whatever their understanding of mathematics at that point was. And I really do think that this is something that we've been really, really focused on, is that there are so many elements in those activities that are good for global health, not just acquisition of cognitive content, but when you're part of a community, when you create and have learning experiences while you're working on a play together, or while you're trying to learn how to be in the marching band together, or how you're learning how to run a play together in sport, all of those things give you repetitions with sharing, with compromise, with understanding, with learning how to communicate. And all of those things that are called soft skills turn out to be the most important in the workplace and in civic life. And you talk to anybody in the corporate world, and they'll tell you they have no problem whatsoever finding people that have hard skills. They have a real problem finding people with soft skills. And actually, it's been over the last 15 years, it's become increasingly almost catastrophic for a lot of corporate environments, that the people that they're coming out of, colleges are smart, but completely socially impaired. They don't know how to be part of a team. They're not good at communicating with customers. This is what you learn in school, at lunch, and in drama, and in band, and on a sports team. So I think that those things need to be recentered. And then the third thing that I think is really important is to take really good care of your educators and give them time to be regulated themselves. Because if they're not valued and they're not taken care of, because of this neurobiology of sort of neurosociology, there's essentially a contagion to emotional states. And the driver of that usually is the leader of a group. So in a classroom, the leader is the teacher. And if the teacher feels frustrated and overwhelmed and sleep deprived and underpaid and not respected, their ability to stay regulated will be compromised. And because they're the leader of this group, they will not be able to regulate optimally the students that they're trying to teach. So you really need to, it's interesting in NME, this intentional process that we put together, we center the teacher, not the student. This is almost all of this work goes towards helping educators understand some of these concepts, and then understanding the application of these concepts in their own work and in their own lives. And how do they come into the classroom regulated? What's going to regulate you? How do you create healthy teamwork with your educators, your teachers? How do you support each other so that when you go into the classroom, you can take advantage of these concepts and apply them in a way that will lead to optimal learning? But none of it will happen if you don't take care of your teachers.
That's very powerfully said. And clearly it has to be an organizational approach to really modeling and enabling teachers to stay connected to each other, to themselves, to a sense of well-being, regulation in the moment. And so what is the best way, do you think, when a teacher is in a moment of dysregulation, feel your temperature rising, somebody has made a rude remark in your classroom, what is the best way in that moment for the teacher to re-regulate and then respond from that place?
Yeah, that's the dilemma. So here's part of the issue. And again, I don't want to skirt, I'm not trying to avoid the answer. I just want to point out that we could sit around and talk forever about what that teacher should do or how they should act. But the truth is, we structurally have set them up to fail, because the ratio of regulated adult to learning student is so skewed into a non-biologically respectful ratio that it's almost impossible. I mean, you can be a teacher that knows collaborative problem solving, and I know all about the brain, and I know all about regulation. But when somebody's yelling at you and spitting at you, and you got 29 other kids looking at you, there's no technique that's going to make that much better. This is where you have to start thinking about the creation of developmental heterogeneity. And and so I am a big fan of of team teaching. I'm a big fan of trying to create heterogeneous developmental opportunities where not all the time, but episodically, you have the fifth graders come in and play a role in teaching with, supervision, teaching the first graders. And every school has some version of like reading buddies or something like that, those, that kind of relational support for the educator is really important. And you can intentionally think about ways to take advantage of that. So I'm not going off on a tangent, but let's go back into the reality of the classroom because this structure doesn't exist yet. These places are trying to get towards team teaching. Places are trying to get towards, being able to page somebody to come in and help you. There are little Band-Aid fixes. Now, one of the most important Band-Aid fixes is when the teacher begins to feel they're getting dysregulated, is that rather than feeling the pressure to solve the problem in the moment, they need to recognize the power of the gap, the power of spacing. You, instead of stepping forward and raising your voice, you need to step back and lower your voice. And go about the business of taking your own temperature, make sure that you're regulated enough to kind of go back in because all of the interesting cognitive things that you may have learned about what to do, once you get dysregulated, you don't have access to them. And so in order to sort of whatever techniques you've learned, whether it's crisis intervention model or the collaborative problem solving or whatever it is that you've learned, you can't really do it properly when you're dysregulated. So you need to kind of have these little defaults about, all right, I need to take a step back. I'm literally going to take 3 deep breaths and then and trust that as I do that, the next thing I should say and do will reveal itself. And usually it does. Now, most of the time when a kid's like that, there's not a pretty ending. Um, you know, the kids don't get taught, the rest of the class doesn't get taught during that time. The rest of the class is studying you to see how you're going to handle it. Are they going to melt down? It's actually, I hate to say it, but it's kind of entertaining for the other kids. Sometimes it's scary, but a lot of times it's like, oh, watch this. This will be kind of interesting. And so kids who've been bored all day long by learning about geology start going, oh, I don't have to learn about rocks for a little while. Let's learn about human behavior. And they watch this and they see how you treat this person, how you manage the situation. Are you going to be sensible? Are you going to recognize that this person is struggling because they were shamed because the truth is they're in a class they shouldn't be in? Because there's a lot of different reasons that these acting out things can happen. But if they see you be respectful and you be humane and you be kind globally, you're going to basically be able to turn what looks like a bad event into a win for the class. And this is why it's so important that you stay regulated and that we take the educators and we take care of them, because if they go into a classroom and they feel safe and respected and regulated, and then they get dysregulated a little bit by one kid, it'll be easier for them to get back down to their baseline quicker. But if they come into the classroom already dysregulated because they're overwhelmed, they've been given responsibilities way beyond what they should have, they're having to cover for somebody else who left because whatever, and because everybody's got demoralized and we're down 3 FTEs and we still have to teach these kids, and then they get dysregulated, they literally going to be dysregulated the rest of the day. And so you don't just lose that one class, you lose every class after that. And again, I'm talking about this like it's easy to act on. It's not. But I can tell you that if you don't take care of the educators, it doesn't matter if you have gone through crisis intervention training and you check the box and we have done, we have tier one collaborative problem solving people. It doesn't matter because they're going to still get dysregulated and you're going to have the long-term impact of, all of that.
Lots in there. I really appreciate that this can't be, the onus can't be on the individual to solve this in their, own setting, in their own classrooms. It really has to be a structural solution, but also that there are these tools that we can use in the moment when any of us will feel that temperature rising, right, and feel dysregulated, and then the impact that that can really have not only on the rest of the school day, but really I've heard you talk about how these micro moments can influence the trajectory of a kid's life. We all remember teachers who treated us with value and belongingness and respect, and the impact that that has had on
Absolutely.
the way in which we became older kids and adults and leaders and colleagues and
Yeah.
parents, really,
Yeah.
caregivers. So I'd like to transition us now just to some audience Q&A. We've started getting a few questions. Let me start with one from Eliza Grosh. So the question is, in our district, parents are taking this extracurricular activities, drama, music, sport to another level. So much so that it stresses kids out because they want them to get A's and get into the best colleges, and there is no rest. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, boy, that's such an important point. The the overscheduling of children is something that's really, really not good. Um, and and so let me talk about this a little bit because one of the most important elements in helping your brain absorb new content is, for lack of a better word, I don't want to go into the whole neurobiology of it, but it's like vegging out, literally downtime. Downtime is essential for you to consolidate information and take it from short-term memory and move it to longer-term memory so that then after you get some REM sleep, that will be stored in your brain. It'll be locked in your brain for a longer period of time. And so we're doing two things in the modern world that impair the efficiency of uh, internalizing and effectively absorbing the things that we're taught in school. The first thing is that we don't give adequate consolidation time. So information comes in, it goes into immediately goes into active working memory, then it gets moved into one version of short-term memory. It won't move from that first version of short-term memory to the next version of short-term memory unless we have a little bit of time to think about what we've heard. Where does that fit with things that we already know? How does that add to our current working version of the world? And you hope it does because we keep adding more and more and more in mathematics and understanding history. We keep adding another thing and another layer, another layer. But if that's not well consolidated through downtime during the day, and you go from one class to the next class to the next class to soccer to homework to sleep deprivation to get not enough sleep, then get up and go to school and do it again, and then you have music and you have this and you have that. I'm not saying don't value those things. I'm saying that the addition of too much extracurricular time impairs both family time and it impairs downtime. And so I think the key thing is to think with your child about how they want to do the sport. Do they want to just do the sport when it's available through school, or do they want to join a traveling team? That means that you're going to do this all year long, and you're going to travel on, with the traveling soccer team to this town and that town, and you know, that might not be the best choice in the long run. I do think that these are the things that families have to debate, but I think we need to recognize that it's actually really, 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 really good for kids to have non-structured play. Pickup basketball games are probably better for you than organized basketball games. going to the rec and shooting around with some kids that you kind of know but not know that well, that's probably better for you in the long run than going to practice on a team that you might never you just sit on the bench and never play. And again, I love sport, I love drama. All these things are important, but these are if you do them in school, they usually have the guardrails so that they're not too crazy. Um, and and so I do think I would definitely have seen what I can't remember her name, but I definitely see this all the time. I see kids that get exhausted and they get burned out. And even promising athletes or promising musicians or promising dancers, they get to the point where they start to make their own choices about how they spend their time. And as soon as they can, they quit rather than having that gift nurtured the right way and grown in a way that they will stay motivated and engaged and continue to improve as they get older into young adult life. It happens with swimmers, gymnasts. It happens where a lot of people sort of very quickly specialize in whatever the activity it is. And where I'm actually talking with a child actor later today, same thing, literally just an inability to bring moderation to the activity in the long run during development can really backfire.
Amen to all of that. Um, from Edward Tracy, you're going to like this one. Should a counselor consider counseling a student sitting side by side with them rather than facing them?
I would say yes, and I would say the counselor should consider taking a walk with them instead of, and again, that, sometimes kids don't want to know that there's with the counselor and that sort of thing. But um, I'll either, if I'm going to be face to face with a kid, I'm either throwing a ball back and forth, playing catch, playing cards, doing something that's some kind of regulatory activity. Or if I'm just sitting around talking with them, I'll do the same thing. I'll be sitting next to them on a couch and I'll bounce a ball off the wall. And but it's if you make some kind of, back and forth activity and you're in parallel, you'll have a much better likelihood of having them ultimately open up a little bit than if you just start face to face and you're trying to get them to tell you what's wrong, what happened, blah, blah, blah.
A question from somebody who's anonymous. Can you speak to how nutrition affects the three R's? I see a lot of kids come in with symptoms of, for example, anxiety or depression, and they haven't eaten. Is there
Yep.
anything to help besides psychoeducation?
Well, food. And again, some of the most sort of historically useful studies about the power of regulation and cognition is the studies that were done that show that kids that get breakfast actually learn better and do better on tests. And that's a very well-established body of evidence, and it really speaks to the regulation part of interoception. That term interoception, your internal feedback about what's going on, right? Is your bladder full? Are you hungry? Are you thirsty? Are you cold? Those things, those signals will basically activate the stress response system and shut down the cortex. So you're not going to retrieve things that you've learned as well, and you're not going to put new things in as well. So being fed is really, really, really important. Now, that a very important emerging area in our field is relating to what you are fed. And it's turning out that we really have a number of psychonutritional areas to explore and understand. And unfortunately, a lot of the diets of kids that in every household, there are far too many sugars, far too many sort of processed foods that are um, really potentially having impact on our our thinking, our feeling, our behavior, certainly changes our general sort of state of regulation. And I think as that field emerges and expands, we're going to learn a lot more about the importance of not just new kind of broad base nutrition, but like the specifics of nutritional interventions and nutritional experiences as they relate to capacity to learn and so forth.
Lots more to come on that. One question related to the possibility of starting the school day later. What are your thoughts on the overall length of the school day? Should that shift to ending later as well with just having better rest?
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead on
yeah,
that.
yeah. No, again, good question. Um, there's an interesting set of experiences in education where Finland was way behind the developed countries in terms of literacy and school achievement and everything. So they sent a bunch of their academic people in education to the US. And one of them went to Stanford School of Education and learned all about the research and the evidence about how people learn and what was the best thing to do in schools. So they went back to Finland and they implemented these things that they learned. And all this, almost all the studies that they acted on, that they used to act on to change their systems, were from the US. And all of a sudden, their literacy rates went up to the top 3 or 4 of all the Western countries, and they had these great outcomes. And and so here's what they did. They tripled recess time. They stopped testing almost universally. They shortened the school day. And I mean, we wouldn't really recognize it as education the way we do education. And I remember reading this in this Stanford. I'm a Stanford alum, and I get this Stanford alum magazine, and there was an interview with him, and they're asking like, well, God, how did you make these incredible changes? And he just said, well, we just took the research that was done in the U.S. and applied it. And I just thought, wow, how pathetic that, we know what it would lead to better academic outcomes, but we're doing almost the exact opposite. People, not everywhere, but a lot of places, particularly after COVID, are getting really, 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 let's catch up. Let's put our foot on the pedal with cognitive content and shove it down the throats of kids. And it is well intended, but it is so biologically counterproductive. And, and we're seeing the results. Kids aren't catching up. Teachers are getting more burned out. Schools are having lots of problems. And I think it's because we have not really acted on what we know about the biology of learning. And a big part of it is you learn best when you're regulated. You learn best when you have, when you understand the concept of dosing and spacing. What's what's a proper dose and duration of introducing something new? And then what's the appropriate period of time to consolidate and internalize? And then when do we have another dose? And this is something that is crucial, and this is really important concept in therapeutics. It's an important concept in sport. But interestingly enough, sports physiologists have understood spacing and dosing better than educators. They know how to change the cardiorespiratory system and your neuromuscular system faster and more efficiently than we know how to change the cortex. And their secret is when they do lifting, how people get stronger? They don't lift weights every day for 45 minutes. They lift weights for a few minutes in a specific muscle group, and then they rest it for 3 days. And then they come back and do it again. And a month later, they're like, they've increased their strength by 40%. But if they lifted that same amount of weight every day, every day, every day, every day, you don't get any strength. You actually wear down the muscle, and you get breakdowns, you get injuries, you get further behind. And I think this is something that we really have to look at very carefully in education. How do we dose and space the acquisition of new content? And how do we contextualize it? How do we give it emotional, contextual vehicles so that we learn it better? This is why we're storytelling creatures. We learn things best in stories. But what we do is we dissect a story out and we teach, all right, you're going to teach this part of the story, you're going to teach that part of the story, you're going to teach this part of the story. And pretty soon we have math and English and history. You could put them all together and teach all concepts in all those different domains by telling a really good story. That's why, for example, the Oregon Trail, that that video thing was really effective at teaching kids concepts. But anyway, I'm off on a tangent, so sorry.
The Oregon Trail, I remember and love it. So another question around how to do productive downtime. Do digital activities count?
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of parents will tell you that one of their kids want to come home and like do video games for a little while, right? And that's like, that can screen time can be a very useful thing to get kids regulated. And so I'm not at all opposed to the use of that kind of screen time for kids to have sort of some aspect of kind of vegging out. I certainly know that there are times when I'll get done giving a day-long training and I'll go back to a hotel room and I'll just literally sit in front of a television with a remote and go, "Zzz, zzz, zzz." I mean, after a while, I realized I've been watching Japanese TV for 10 minutes and I don't understand a single word, but I'm just sitting there like a zombie. And so I do think that it can play a role in that. It's like anything. It's all about moderation, right? If you give a little dose of it to kind of get re-regulated and come back and, play for half an hour and then we're going to get ready for dinner and have dinner. And then you can focus on your whatever you have, your homework. You've kind of regulated yourself. You're not hungry. You have time now. Now let's do your homework. Um, I do think that there's a risk, that it's easy to get lost and to waste minutes or find minutes being wasted if you do like too much social media, as all of us who've ever sort of done a little bit of scrolling on, whatever, if those of you who do that. But, I'll find myself looking at beautiful photographs on Instagram. I like to look at nature photos, and after a while, I'm like, oh, that was 8 minutes. Wow. You know, that's gone. But sometimes you need a little bit of brain break, which is fine. But that's why I put a little bit of a tag on when I'm on anything for longer than 5 minutes. I'll just get a little buzz just to remind myself that, oh, all right.
I like that. I think that's a great note to close us out on. And what I'll share here in the chat, my colleague Erin will put in a link to a 5-part PBS series that encapsulates many of the concepts that we covered today and goes a little bit deeper in some directions, just if you want more to watch and learn from Dr. Perry. And we'll also send out the link to that PBS series on our follow-up email. Thank you so much, Dr. Perry, for spending this time with us today and giving us the benefit of your extensive wisdom in these domains. And thank you, everyone who is logged in and joined us live. As you click away from our screen, what you'll see is a quick 1-minute survey to help you connect with us at Daybreak if you'd like to learn more about how to get connected with us and learn more about our services. And with that, I will wish everybody a great rest of your week and happy Thanksgiving to all who celebrate.
This is awesome. Thank you, my friend.
Yeah, this is a lot of fun. Thank you for doing this with us.
All right, guys.
All right. Take care, everybody.